lovely to be here. This is my first masterclass ever, and I'm just familiarizing myself with the whole Zoho meeting. So it's quite special to be here during this time. And I'm thanking all the students who, of course, opted to spend their afternoon and evening in my company and the company of all of us. And I hope you'll enjoy my masterclass. So hello, everybody. My name is Zuzana Gombosova. And I will tell you a little bit about my practice, which touches upon development of new material, but also many other things, many more things that you'll find out. And I am here talking to you from Kochi, which is the southern state, which is in southern state of Kerala in India. So we can pass the next slide. Next.
Oh, sorry. I'm also admitting students and sorry. Yes.
Okay. We have something missing here, but never mind. So I would like to begin talking to you through a perspective of my geographical movements throughout the globe over time, because I believe having the opportunity to live and to experience different places in a world had a massive, impact on not only who I am, of course, my identity, but the line of my work. My work wouldn't probably be what it is today if I didn't pass through all these places that formed me. And so I'll begin with the place where I was born. Next.
Yes.
Or maybe I can just give you like a sign when it's
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, this is good. Sorry.
So where was I made? I was made in Slovakia. Slovakia is a small country in Central Europe, in case you haven't heard of it. We formerly used to be Czechoslovakia, one of the fastest growing industries in terms of textile industry in the world in 1960s. However, we moved quite far from that over the time. And I, in particular, come from a place called Vinne. It's a relatively small place, as you can see. It only has 1,843 inhabitants. So I imagine many of you come from metropolitan areas. So I don't know if you can imagine how it is if you grow up, in a place like that. But obviously, you are curious about everything else in the world. Although you grow up surrounded by greenery, by nature, which, looking back at my childhood, was an amazing thing that happened to me. And another kind of special thing about the place where I was born is the tradition that keeps being sustained in our area, in my village, and that is winemaking. In my village, almost everybody makes wine. It's a homemade wine, and very, very few people actually opt to sell their products. Most of the production is actually drunk within the family. So yeah, it keeps us happy and connected all the time. But apart from that, from early on, you start recognizes, microbial processes, and they're important for transformation of everything around you, everything that you experience, that you taste, and so that's something that I might not have realized when I was little, but obviously it continues forming me until this very day.
Next.
And yes, next. And I think I decided that I wanted to study design, or apparel and textile design in particular, sometimes when I was 14 or 16. I don't exactly remember what was the point when I decided, but I always knew I loved making things, I liked producing things, and I liked working with human body. Sort of was an interesting expression tool for me, clothes and making them. And so when I was 16, I think I decided, okay, I'm gonna have a go with it. It was not received very well with my family, of course, because they imagined I would be studying medicine or, you know, law or one of the other things that are popular. But luckily, my sister supported me in the decision, and so I decided, you know, I'm going to dedicate everything to this. And it was a decision that I had to fight for. And when I was 18, I graduated from a grammar school, and I enrolled at a university in Czech Republic. It was a technical university with that had a department for apparel and textile design. At the time, it was a little boring for me because I wanted to be in a bigger city, of course. And I wasn't in the capital, but I was, you know, like in the second largest city, maybe. But it was a great time. And looking back at it, I think this was the first time that I really started thinking differently, because only when you, I think, start studying something art or design related, you realize how different actually designers think. It doesn't matter whether you're designing clothes, you know, airplanes, I don't know, aquaponics. It doesn't matter. You simply think differently than most of the other people. And I think it was in the second year of my studies, I got selected to go for a workshop to Germany with a bunch of, you know, students from universities all around Europe, and that's where I found a link to my next destination, which was Istanbul. I decided I really wanted to go and study to Istanbul, regardless of the fact that I've never been there before. But somehow I felt it's a great place to be. And so I went there to study at Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University as an exchange student. And I think we can pass.
Yes.
And it was a great place to experience from different reasons, you know. And if you study apparel or textiles in a smaller country such as Czech Republic or Slovakia, you're very much the education is very, very different. You're very much pushed to stress your own, you know, designer identity, and to think about what kind of designer you are, and to use fashion mostly as a tool of expression and communication. Everything okay?
Yes.
Okay.
There was just a student who unmuted herself. Please carry on.
Okay.
Please carry
Okay. But you know, Turkey is a massive country. Obviously smaller than India, but still it's relatively big, with a very well developed textile and fashion industry. So it was a very different experience to study there, because all you know, the focus of education was to bring you as a designer and educate you to become a part of an industry, which was a very different viewpoint from the former education that I received. But I liked it very much at the time. You know, it was much more dynamic. You got a feedback from industry players. You know, you kind of felt like, you know, that you are going somewhere and that you maybe are going to have a job after graduating. Whereas, you know, back in Czech Republic and Slovakia, people just looked at you, oh my God, like poor parents, you know, what are they going to do with a design graduate? But here the story was different. And so I stayed as an exchange student for 2 years, which was, I think, the longest time anybody could stay there. And it was a formative place for me from many perspectives. You know, I got a chance also to travel to remote places in Turkey, where, of course, besides seeing the very different social, economic conditions in the country, you also see people's connection with the craft much stronger. You know, you see people taking material from the very resource. For example, here in my presentation, you can see a Kurdish woman spinning woolen yarn. It is probably, you know, Kurdistan or southeastern Turkey is probably a place where one of the oldest craft related to textiles originated. And you can still see there, even though the survival is very much impacted by political situation. And And so you have people living, and surviving in this manner where they still are very close to the source of the material. They process everything themselves. They weave the fabric. And on another hand, you come back to Istanbul, which is obviously a global city. And I remember we visited a lot of factories. We worked with a lot of factories as part of our curriculum. And you see, textiles in a completely different scales. You see factories churning thousands of meters of fabric, thousands of denim pieces, as in this case. And that was, I think, the first time I kind of realized the relation of scale and impact of what I actually chose to do can have on the real world. It was no longer, the girl who was studying fashion and textiles to express her creativity, but you actually influence a lot of things around the world. And I spent 4 years in Turkey, which was great. And I got a chance to work as an apparel designer there for a local brand. But I gradually realized, I like my job, but I don't really like this industry where I'm working, because it's not treating people fair, and it's treating resources as if they were never ending. So I was looking for ways to maybe rethink what I do and try to find ways of doing it in a different manner. And I got a chance to enroll at the MA course in London, which is my next destination. And at the time, I was deciding between studying, continuing my studies within fashion and textiles, but internally I was looking for an education that would bring me more than just, perfecting my craft or my knowledge in that area, but I was looking for studies that would perhaps show me more holistic way of thinking about a design process. And I chose a course called Textile Futures at a time. Right now it's called Material Futures, which is taught at Central St. Martin's College of Arts and Design. And again, this was a whole different story. I always, until this day, I have a great difficulty to describe the course, because it includes so many different views and different directions and different ways of thinking. So here in the slide, sort of sum up the connotations that it has, or the thought bubbles that it contains. This course, teaches you about circularity. This course tries to teach you how to think critical about your own work, which can seem more difficult than, which is more difficult than it might seem. It teaches you how to think about your practice and your projects in long term. You're not only thinking about, next season, next year. You're thinking 50 years onwards, 100 years onwards. What will happen? How will my work have? What will be the impact of my work in that? It's interdisciplinary. You're no longer confined by the boundaries of your own practice. You can think in whatever direction you want. So it's very liberating. It's very hands-on if you wish to. It's one of the few courses at the college, I think, that has access to most of the workshops, which is a great advantage. And of course, it's futuristic because you get to think about a lot of things. But this is a course that takes 2 years, and it really takes you through a lot of different things.
Next. Okay.
Yes. And so I just want to give you a very brief idea of how it was for me. The whole course started with a very simple, innocent project brief, which asks you to explore material properties of material of your choice. And so I started exploring bubble wrap out of all things. I don't really remember why. And I was trying to find out how we can merge this kind of realm of living and evolving with something like a plastic, which I guess was somehow the initial idea to what I continue doing till this day. You can pass to the next one.
Yes.
And also, a part of study was a lot of bizarre things. For example, in the first year, our tutors took us to rural Wales to engage in coracle making workshops. So here's me and my course mate Daniela sitting in a boat that we made. Mm. And these boats were actually put inside the water to test how well we made it. So it was a very interesting way of, putting us straight into, immersing us into the making process, and also creating kind of strong bonds between ourselves as a student. Most of the girls that, I studied with, we are very good friends until this day. And it's only when you leave the school that you realize why it's so important to, cherish these relationships. Can pass on.
Yes.
So here we're still in the first year. It was very confusing. We were given all sorts of different projects. Different experts were brought to give us workshops and to give us lectures. For example, here is a project which resulted from a workshop called Biofactoring, which was led by Carol Collet, who's a lady who actually founded the whole course. It's a very inspiring woman. And she gave us a workshop on how to grow gourds into, particular shapes. So it's a type of alternative manufacturing of components for, whatever design idea you have. So as a result of the workshop, for example, in my case, I designed this making method for the parts of the puppet or doll. Yes, doll. And or a simple way how to make a lamp shape. We also had a tutor called Neil Harbinson, who is a very interesting person. He's, I think, one of the first cyborgs in the world. So when he came to teach us, he had literally an antenna sticking out of the back of his head, and I think he was born colorblind, and this device implanted in his head allowed him to feel the colors in as a sort of musical vibrations. I think so that's how we were able to perceive colors. And his girlfriend had another device implanted in her forearm that was able to receive seismic activity. I don't know, I guess it might be handy if you live in Japan or somewhere. But it was very, very diverse, and often you were wondering, what am I actually studying here? I don't understand. But we only came to understand later at the end of first year. This was basically an introduction for us to all sorts of different ways of thinking and directions where design thinking is pondering these days. One of the very interesting projects we worked on was a project called Extreme, where we were asked to explore the materiality of something extreme. That was all that we were given. And so we were asked to find several experts that will guide our research, and to then develop not necessarily a design, not necessarily something physical, but just to construct our research question in a profound way. So I spent a long time pondering what extreme could I possibly study. And it struck me somehow that we are a part of nature, we are part of this planet, but yet we very, very rarely think about our own bodies as a source of materials, because each of us use ourselves with particular identity. We view our bodies very often as something sacred that is not necessarily there to give. So I was thinking about, what is there on the human that we could actually consider a material? And so I found three different experts my first expert was um, a molecular mixologist called Paul Tvarov, who has his own kind of a lounge bar in East London, and he's Czech, by the way, and he taught me how to change matter, organic matter into different forms. How, for example, I just went to visit him in his lounge, and he started explaining to me, how he works, what approaches he has, and suddenly he made me, I think it was Campari soda, where the taste of Campari was basically infused into, how do you call it, the sugar fluff. And the Campari was sitting in a small bottle. So I was like, wow, I didn't even know you can do something like that. Second expert that I found was molecular gastronomist or cook, whom I remember I asked him what to do with, a matter that like comes from a human body, for example. It's organic, it's a subject to decomposition, to constant transformation. So what will you do with it? So, for example, he introduced me to a lot of different cooking techniques where, or some traditional cooking methods that you can transform basically organic matters into something, let's say, that is solid, or that stays for a little while. And my third expert was a molecular biologist, Miss Monica Gulerova, who introduced me to the realm of molecular biology at the time. It was a very short project, but I have to say I learned incredibly a lot of information. We can pass to the next slide.
Yes.
And so, looking at a human body, what can we derive from it? There's our skin, there's our hair, there's our fat, there's the gelatin, there are our bones, there's, of course, the blood. So obviously this project didn't have a lot of practical implications. It was more of a, idea exercise. But so what can we do? There's lots of things that you can actually do with all these things. And I decided to focus, I think, on the human blood. I don't even remember why, but I think it was mostly because it remains very sacred as a liquid. It's one of the very few liquids from the human body we actually cannot produce synthetically. We can pass to the next one.
Yes.
And so my research or an outcome of this project was a couple of scenarios. How could a world where we actually derive materials from human body look like? What do we have in our kitchens then? How do we store these materials? Do we store our own, samples of DNA, like in a kitchen right next to the eggs, or like, what is it? So these are just a few examples. I did a distillation of blood because the molecular gastronomist told me, you can actually distill blood. So I was like, that's cool. And you can get a pure water. Distillation is basically a process of separation, liquids from the solids. So if you take blood as your material, you can distill pure water as a liquid, whereas the solid parts will stay in a different flask. So I proposed a recipe for an alternative Bloody Mary. But also blood is a very interesting material, and historically it actually has been used in the production of materials. For example, animal blood has been used in the 19th century especially from around the area of slaughterhouses near Paris, where there was a lot of concentration of this matter, and it was found out that blood is basically a lot of different things, but it also contains proteins. Proteins are very good binders. So blood is a good binder, and that's why they started making or using blood for making one of the early pre-oil plastics. It used to be called bois d'ortie, and it basically consists of animal blood.
No class masuk ke?
Sorry. Sweekriti, please mute yourself. Please stay on mute. Sorry, Zuzana.
No problem. You can pass to the next slide.
Okay.
And yeah, that was the first year. You know, after first year, we were asked, okay, so next year you're only going to be working on your final project. So all of us were pretty confused. I remember that vividly because we were exposed to so many different things that we didn't even know if we were still designers, you know, or what are we doing on this course. But having this experience and, you know, of working with the organic, somehow I was drawn to that direction. And at the time, there were also a lot of or few interesting projects within the design realm that were kind of exploring this area of human interaction with the realm of, you know, microorganisms or fungi or bacteria, and, you know, how could these industries actually work. And so when somebody asked me why, you know, biomaterials or living materials, I think there's a nice quote by William Myers, who wrote a book, Biodesign, who says the motivation behind his research lies in the hypothesis that living technology can foster a new approach and address some of the key sustainable challenges of the 21st century. And it is a long sentence, and I know it might sound a little boring, but it's actually true. I started reading, you know, a lot about microbes suddenly because I read in an article in one of the journals, we actually, supposedly, scientists say that we have actually explored more from the outer universe around our planet than we have explored from, you know, our own microbiome on this planet. You know, 99 or maybe a bit more than 99% of microbiome remains unexplored. So now imagine how many possibilities there are within the realm of bacteria, fungi, you know? And when you start studying microbiology a little bit more, I'm not saying, you know, I'm a microbiologist, but obviously when you start reading, you find out actually, yes, you know, the research says that there is a microbe that has the potential to transform most of our processes currently used in the industry. There is. You know, there are microbes that are able to process materials. There are microbes that we are able to use as sensors. There are microbes that we are able to use as catalysts for certain, you know, reactions. There are microbes that assemble things for us. There are ones that disassemble for us. We can even store information like IT data inside microbes. So I became fascinated with that idea because it seemed like an area where one can explore a lot. We can pass to the next slide. And
Yes.
I started, as I started reading about this area, I kind of first created a structure for categorization because it was so much information. So I started putting different microbes of my interest, you know, in groups and finding out what they, you know, what do they eat or what they feed on, what are they capable of, you know, how to cultivate them. Is it difficult? Is it easy? And I was experimenting with growing different kinds. At the beginning, I collaborated with a microbiologist from the University of Surrey, Mr. Simon Park, and he kind of introduced me to the very basic methodology that microbiologists use to cultivate or to culture certain microorganisms. And gradually, I kind of blended with one particular microorganism called Acetobacter ptillinum. And this bacterium is able to grow cellulose. This type of cellulose is called bacterial cellulose. And you might be knowing it from projects of maybe Susan Lee or Janice Hudson, maybe. She designed a jacket out of bacterial cellulose in around 2000, maybe 4, I don't know. And this material was easy to culture, easy to grow. And since I had a limited time, because this was basically my final project and there's only that much time you have, I also find out this actually gives me quite fast results, so I'm able to experiment in relatively short time. And so I started reading scientific articles mostly because, when you're working with something not relatively well explored, you have to find literature in sources where people have explored it already. So, if you wanted to work with a piece of wood, obviously you would go maybe to a library, pick up a book about, crafting with wood or woodworking, and that's where you learn. But there is no such book on bacterial cellulose because it's very new. And so I had to go and reach out to the field of study where people have already experimented with this method. And I found out there's actually different methodologies for growing this material. You can pass to another slide. And
yes,
slowly I started,
yes,
slowly I started discovering, how to work with this living matter. And you're actually able to, grow it in flat sheet. You're able to grow it in kind of different profiles. You're even able to grow it in a three-dimensional shape. There's a lot of different ways to do that. So for example, here you can see one of my homemade bioreactors based on water pump and timer, which was feeding my bacterial cellulose culture from the top, which allowed it to grow vertically, which is kind of a different method. And it was inspired by scientific device invented by Dr. Schmauer from Germany. And, a lot of these experiments ended up in failure, and that's completely normal because that's the nature of all experiments. So I was very lucky to have actually tutors in school with an understanding for that. Like sometimes you just come to your to your review and you just cannot bring anything because your bacteria died, for example. That happens. So so yeah, I somehow was able to continue. We can pass to the next slide. And as a result of my final project, I was interested to know how, from a standpoint of a maker, maybe a designer, somebody who wants to make, how will we approach materials that grow, that live, that we need to nurture, rather than just use. And so we can pass to the next slide. And so I designed a concept for a machine, which I call the feeder, which is able to control certain aspects of growth of this living material. So if we pass to a next slide, you'll see, yeah, so that's the feeder. It's based on structure of 3D printer, so it can move, different pieces. And it basically has a kind of a syringe with the nutrients in there, which deposits nutrients to the surface of the bacterial culture and the bacterial cellulose, and that forces it to grow upwards, and you can basically change the way your material grows. Now this was more challenging than I initially expected. I actually made this whole thing, so besides learning how to culture and grow living materials, I also learned how to weld and how to assemble a 3D printer. And yeah, I have to say I was rather exhausted after this year. But it was a type of project that doesn't necessarily gives you an instant, satisfaction or an instant result, but it opens up a way of thinking for you, which I think somehow and many times is more important when studying something in depth. So we can pass to the next slide.
yes.
And yeah, just talking about different ways or different thoughts that working on this project opened up for me, yes, this project or this device basically could have commercial outcomes, It could become a manufacturing tool for the makers. It could become, a device for all the kombucha brewers, to modify their SCOBY. Or it could also be a research tool, which was somehow more interesting for me. And in fact,
Yes.
after the graduation, I had quite a few opportunities to exhibit and to show my project to a lot of different audiences. I got an opportunity to show it at London Design Week in 2014. We went to Domus Pilsen, which is the exhibition that you can see in the picture on the right side. It was a massive greenhouse, which was designed by, of course, I forgot his name. Never mind, a very interesting designer. Maybe I'll remember on the way. But he basically got a brief from the organizers of the exhibition to design a temple for 21st century. And so he designed a greenhouse, and inside the greenhouse, they were shown on a variety of design projects or, prototypes that were somehow pondering between the relationship of humans and nature, or somehow combining them. So they selected the theater as well, which was, I think, by far the most beautiful place it ever landed in. We went to Milan Design Week with my former course mate, Daniela Toledo, who was there sitting with me on the coracle, and Dawn Bendick. We formed a collective called All Things in Between. And it was a very interesting experience, for us, 3 fresh graduates. And somehow, my project, I remember I was a little frustrated at the time because every single time I exhibited my project, people came to me and they talked to me and they were like, this is very interesting. And I was like, yes. But, I was still living in London at the time. I was really struggling with jobs and with maintaining that aspect of my life. And I simply couldn't, who will employ you if you have a device for the future? Obviously, you cannot look for a job in Zara or somewhere like that. At least not at the time. And so after 3 years of London, I decided, to go home and kind of rethink what I actually am going to do with everything and all the experience, I gained in London. As it happens, sometimes you see news in life you didn't expect it. I got invited by former course mate to join a research project or design research project in Mumbai, in India. We can pass to the next slide.
Yes.
And it was, it was a whole different world from me. And maybe before I pass it, I just wanted to maybe share with you how something more in general about material, because, after 2 years of studying this material futures, I was no longer a textile and fashion designer, I was very far removed from all that. And that was, nice on one side and also difficult on the other hand, because you just don't really know what you're going to do. But I realized, how much the materials are engraved in our daily lives, in our identities, in even in our history. If you look at the way we name, the epochs of human development, we actually name them according to materials. We had Stone Age, we had Iron Age, we had Bronze Age, and perhaps what we are getting close to these days is the age of the waste. We can pass the next slide.
Yes.
And materials definitely are connected to our lives in so many different ways. When we talk about materials,
I'm sorry.
We
I'm
talk
sorry.
about, no problem. We talk about health. We talk about value. We can talk about sensorial experience. We can talk about materials performance. We can talk about material culture. We can talk about environment. We can talk about beauty of materials and Or we can also talk, which maybe we are just starting talking about waste that is also material and comes from the realm of materials. And
Yes.
so in Mumbai, I got to work on a project that was pitched to an innovation center of a large manufacturing company. And it was a whole different experience again for me because you know I've seen industries and I worked in an industry and I was there in London developing my small material samples, but suddenly you're thrown in a world where it's stuffed with materials, and we were in particular looking at the industrial waste. So we were, my team categorized all different materials that came from every particular factory, their quantities per day, per month, per year, and what's being done with them. And when you see these numbers and you see the quantity of waste, it just strikes you, because you start seeing things in very different perspective. And perhaps, if for you guys in India, that's, something that because you live in such a huge country and you're exposed to so many different scales of things, that's perhaps something that you're more used to. But for me, as a person coming originally from that small village, that was like, wow, okay, we are in deep trouble. And so we named the era that we currently live in the age of waste. And from the calculations that we made, we actually found out that the company is making 120 kilograms of solid waste per minute. So every single minute that you experience this quantity is produced. So my role in the project was identifying 6 materials with a particularly either problematic scenario or with an interesting scenario that I researched extensively. And based on the research and the problem that that there was in this scenario, I developed or I designed a better way of either handling those materials, collecting those materials, recycling those materials, or, which was my favorite, re-engineering those materials into something that can be used again. We can pass to the next slide. And this is just one thing that I carry with me from the factory because I had to, I worked in the factories with the guys working in their daily shifts. The company had particularly interesting way of visual communication. So everywhere around the factories, you would have these graphics, from 1970s telling you how to work safely. So this is one of them. It's called Shortcuts Lead to Deep Cuts, which I find particularly deep. And I just wanted to share it with you. So we can pass on to the next slide. And now I think most of you heard about me or about my projects mostly in connection with coconuts. And so it's okay, don't worry. And so I will make the transition of why actually I am dealing with coconuts these days. As I mentioned to you, I came to India to work on a project in Mumbai. But somehow, back in my mind, I kept an idea that it might be an interesting place to continue my research with bacterial cellulose, because I remembered from the research at the time, bacterial cellulose, or they say that bacterial cellulose is actually native to Philippines, where they call it nata de coco. Nata de coco literally means cream of coconut. And in Philippines, there's basically kind of cottage industry that works there, where bacterial cellulose is grown from water from mature coconut. And when I came to India, I saw coconuts everywhere. So I was like, oh, wow, there's got to be plenty of people who do it here as well. I couldn't find anybody though. And I met my colleague basically at the time while I was still working for a company in Mumbai, and it was Susmit, who is the co-founder of Malai Biomaterials. And he happens to come from the land of coconuts, or Kerala. So when I was telling him about the work or the research that I did before, and that it actually, this material can be grown on water from mature coconuts, which is waste product in most of the coconut processing units, he got very interested, and we also happen to share, similar interests. We are both very hands-on people, makers, and we believe in circular economy, and we want to do our work in the most sustainable way possible.
एक बार आ तो
Sorry.
अच्छा
Sorry.
No problem.
We had to unmute another student. Can I just make an announcement? Students, please stop unmuting yourselves. Muskan Nagdev, you're unmuting yourself again and again. I will be forced to remove you from the masterclass. Sorry, Zuzana.
No problem.
Please continue. Sorry.
Yes.
So, ma'am, in
yes,
case you're
students,
unable to
please.
unmute her, you could just directly click on the three dots when you click on her name, and you can then either unmute or remove. If this happens once again, I suggest you remove this. Yes, please continue.
Okay. And so what is
Okay. I have
Nata
removed
de Coco?
Muskan Nagdev.
Okay.
Please continue.
Shall this be a warning to all of you? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please.
All right.
Okay.
And so how you can actually grow nata de coco, or in order to grow nata de coco, you need a coconut tree. In particular, you need the mature or the brown coconut. When they break it in the coconut processing units, they use the white flesh and the shell, but the water is generally just released into the drainage. But we can actually collect this water, sterilize it, and prepare a medium for bacteria from it. And the whole fermentation process takes 12 to 14 days. You just kind of have a tray with the liquid, which is the nutrient. And over the days, I think after maybe 4 or 5 days, you start noticing kind of a slimy substance on the top of that liquid. That is the initial layer of bacterial cellulose that then continues to grow and grow and grow a bit more. You can let it grow until thickness of 1 centimeter, but you can also continue growing it until it's as thick as this. But generally you would harvest it after 2 weeks, and then you can use it in whatever way you want. You can pass to the next slide.
Yes.
And we are talking about bacterial cellulose, but I think first of all we have to clarify what actually is cellulose, because it's one of these materials that all of you are super familiar with, but maybe you don't really realize that you interact with it on day-to-day basis. Cellulose is the building block of most of the living, cells, plant cells in the world. I think it's the second most abundant material on the planet, and it comes in many forms. Wood or a tree is also made from cellulose. Plant fibers that we make fabrics from, such as hemp, cotton, linen, these are a form of cellulose. I don't know if you are still using them, but the camera films that we used to use in the cameras, these are a form of cellulose, cellulose acetate. And then on the furthermost left, you can see an image scan electron microscopic image of bacterial cellulose. So the cellulose, which is produced by bacteria, you can pass to the next slide. Because the bacteria is very small, the kind of fiber they produce are also in microscopic scale. They are actually nanofibers. We can pass to another slide. And so if you should describe cellulose in kind of from chemical point of view, it's basically a chain of molecules. And normally, if you're talking about, plant-derived cellulose, which means cellulose from the wood, this length of the chain would be maybe, I don't know, 30, 40 molecules. In case of bacterial cellulose, it's much, much longer, so it can go into the thousands. And that's why bacterial cellulose has very different properties. It's much stronger than plant cellulose. It grows in its pure form, so it's much more ecological. You can grow it from feedstock or agricultural waste, and it has potential for many different industries. Not only for, let's say, fashion, but people are exploring its use for medical industry, for food industry, for aeronautical industry, and many more. So I do believe it will become eventually a material of the future, probably just a matter of time. And so what do we do with bacterial cellulose at Malai, which is my practice? Me and Susmit, we decided, let's explore this bacterial cellulose further. But we also knew bacterial cellulose just by itself would be difficult to develop just on its own, because A, it would be quite expensive, and B, it wouldn't be probably stable enough to be used in some sort of more commercial products, such as maybe apparel, maybe packaging, maybe accessories, whatever comes to your mind. So we decided to look for ways how to make this material more viable for products that we want to design, how to develop it further. And we also looked at the materials that were, the other resources that were around us. So what do we have? What else can we work with in this environment? Because we don't want to end up, importing stuff from a different part of the globe. We want to work with local materials. And we can pass to another slide.
Yes.
And that's how we started incorporating natural fibers to our material. So when we started, we actually started in a place called Channapatna, which is a small provincial town, I guess 60 kilometers off Bangalore. And we started there because we found a coconut processing unit that was willing to collaborate with us for, for production of bacterial cellulose. They had a lot of coconut water as a waste, and they also heard that it's possible to, use it somehow. So they were exploring those possibilities, and we found them at that time, at that specific time, and decided to work with them for the development of our product material. Sorry, and we literally started, with a very, very DIY approach. There was almost no funding. We just had our savings really, and we converted our terrace into a kind of a workshop and a lab. So here on the right, you can see Susmit putting together a small hydraulic press for our samples. On the left side, there is my hand that's stained by indigo. I was learning about natural dyes, and very often I had a hand of very different colors. And, we can pass to another slide. And the process of developing material was, at the beginning, actually very spontaneous. We didn't know, we didn't come with an idea of, oh, we want to develop, vegan leather or a material for this and that. We're just spontaneously exploring ways of working with bacterial cellulose, different processes that you can use when you want to work with it, which process is, or which types of or combinations of materials are compatible, in terms of chemistry, but also in terms of environmental science, so that you don't end up combining something like plastic, biodegradable material. We were experimenting with different types of processes that you can use with bacterial cellulose. We were exploring different ways of treating natural fibers. So I think we must have done over 150 different formulations till we arrived to something that we can call something like a basic Malai. And here in 2017, you can see a table full of like different material samples that we developed at the time. These are not all, these are just like probably the first stage of it. And so we went, we worked on this pretty much full time for 7 months. And we were getting feedback from different field experts. So we were, constantly in discussion with material scientists, with chemists, with the process engineer, just to kind of, get an idea. And I remember at the time people were like, oh my God, what are these guys doing? It's completely misguided. But we had fun, so we continued. And I think in the second half of 2017, we had basic, as I mentioned, basic recipe for the material, and we kind of thought it reminds us a little bit of animal leather. It was flexible. You are able to sew it. It has a sort of similar texture. So we were like, that's interesting. Why don't we try making, some sort of accessory out of it and see how it performs? And so that's what we did. On the right side, you can see me holding a piece of Malai, which is 1 meter by 1 meter already. And that's already in Kerala, where we moved afterwards. So we made this transition, and, really it is because we had that luck and that opportunity to fully concentrate on this. And we were able to manage it with the resources that we have. Next slide, please. I started, sending these material samples to all sorts of different material libraries around the world, getting their feedback, thinking, okay, is there actually like demand for this kind of materials? Would the designers and brands be willing to test it, to make something out of it? And we moved, as I mentioned, back to Kerala, and we then converted a house there into our workshop. So there you can see Susmit and me working with a hydraulic or small press that we made for the material. And on the other picture, I am preparing probably a bacterial culture, and you can see the bacterial cellulose, which is like really thick over there. So over the time, we started getting actually quite a lot of feedback and inquiries from people all around the world, and it seems like suddenly we realized, okay, there's actually quite a lot of demand for something that people call vegan leather, and obviously, reasons are there. People gradually think about materials a little more, and they realize that animal leather or the way animal leather is produced does not necessarily always justify the applications where it's used, because it's extremely, resource energy consuming a way of making a material. And we can pass to the next slide. And where are we? Yeah. Here, I don't know if you can actually hear anything in this video, but at least you can see this is the workshop that we have currently. It's still a very basic, and we're still working on improving every single process. But we already have a kind of our own, place to work and to do small scale production, which is great. So what is actually Malai? When we talk about Malai, we can describe it as a biocomposite material. Now, what is a composite material? A composite material is a material that combines fiber and a polymer matrix. So And when you join these two kinds of very different material, they kind of support each other. So they bring out, the best of each other. They have different properties than they would have had alone. And so in our case, it's called biocomposite because we are using polymeric matrix that is biodegradable and that is bio-based, which means it's coming from some sort of natural biodegradable source, or at least natural source. And so I already described the process of making bacterial cellulose. So what you need is basically water from nature coconuts that you let ferment your bacteria on. And we then harvest the sheet of bacterial cellulose and we prepare natural fibers to accept, the bacterial cellulose. So we use banana stem fibers, we use hemp fibers, and sisal plant fibers. All these three types of fibers are cultivated within India, and they are one of the strongest fibers, natural fibers in the world. Now, when it comes to banana fiber, it's extracted not from banana peels, as some people might get an idea. It's actually extracted from the banana stem, because banana plant grows for 2 years. In those 2 years, it gives you the bananas, which is the primary reason why it's cultivated. After that, you basically cut the plant, and the new plant, meanwhile, starts growing, from the bottom part of it. And so generally, the banana stem just gets converted into manure, but actually the stem contains a very beautiful and good quality fibers called banana stem fibers, which is what we use as well. And so we basically join bacterial cellulose and different types of natural fibers with an addition of some natural gums. And we convert this mixture into sheets of materials. And now we can either make flat sheets of material, or as is illustrated here in a picture, we can mold this mixture into three-dimensional shapes. So both of these, outcomes are quite interesting when you think about three-dimensional molding. Of course, it's exciting because basically you are able to surpass a lot of manufacturing steps in making a product. Imagine you're making a bag, you can directly mold it. You don't have to sew it, you don't have to cut it, you don't have any offcuts, nothing like that. And in case of flat sheets, we currently make it in 120 by 80 centimeters large sheets, but actually the shape or the pattern of the sheet depends on your choice. You can actually make it directly in the pattern that you need as well. Next slide, please. And so we, one of the biggest commitments and that we have up until today is maintaining our material biodegradable. It's actually compostable, and here you have a little, ant and a worm munching on a composting malai, or malai that's actually inside a compost for for a few days. But our idea of circularity is, to take something from nature, use it, and then bring it back to nature in a form that the nature can accept. And this might seem like a very simple idea, but it's actually very, very challenging in practical point of view, because if you look at the materials and their compositions today, you can find, pieces of plastic in almost everything. It doesn't necessarily have to be a piece of plastic per se, but you have different types of additives to the material, fillers to the material, coatings to the material, and in most of the cases, they do contain oil-based synthetic materials, which are not biodegradable, and very often they are also toxic. So we said, no, we don't want to do it, like maybe it will take a little longer on the research phase, but we really want to commit to doing what we believe in. And so we are still working on, improving the formulation. But our materials are biodegradable. So if one day you decide, okay, I don't want to use my bag or my shoe any longer, you know, you don't necessarily have to throw it away wherever you go, but you know, you can chop it and feed it to your compost. That's the ideal way of doing things. And next slide, please. And so see, that was a good example for shortcuts lead to deep cuts because there's no way around it. Like you simply, you know, working on something long term really does teach you to value humans around you and to cherish and structure your communication very well, because ultimately that's what you're gonna depend on if you wanna continue working on for something such a long time. So here on this slide, you see some of the first things we actually made from Malai. There are slippers made of Malai, made by one of our first intern, Lucia. She came from Czech Republic and she did an internship with us for 1.5 months in Kerala, exactly during the floods. So it was probably not the best in those terms, but we managed to make several things. One amongst them were these, you know, pair of sandals that were later actually commissioned by a Victoria and Albert Museum as part of their exhibition Foods, the bigger picture. So it's very nice. As a sole, basically outsole, we use coir. We kind of knitted it into a piece of outsole and attached it to it. And you know, coir is probably most a resilient natural fiber. So perhaps using it in this way is not such a bad idea. And on the right side, you can see this was the very first collection of accessories that I designed for Malai or with Malai. And you can see only natural colors. And the kind of specific thing about this was that we didn't use any sewing or any kind of traditional joining. Everything is kind of folded, you know, into each other, so that also the disassembly is made easier in this way. Okay, we can pass to the next slide. And you know, over the, I think 1.5 years, we're kind of identifying, okay, where this material can go, where does it fit, where we can use it, where we cannot use it. And we were in a way very lucky, because more and more companies around the world started looking into need for sustainable materials, for materials that are environmentally friendly, which is, you know, something that was not there like 10 years ago. We would be probably looked upon as a couple of hippies trying to invent compostable materials. But we started getting inquiries from companies of all scales, you know, looking for alternatives to animal hide, alternatives to synthetic fox leather, looking for simply, you know, materials that are done with a consideration for nature. And so over the time, we identified kind of 3 major directions or applications for the material. First one were fashion accessories. You know, the material is suitable for manufacturing techniques where the accessories are currently made, and it is, you know, attractive enough to be used in that way. We tested it for light types of footwear. So here again, you can see sandals made by our former intern Lucia, who made it then her diploma project. And a third area we explored was furniture and upholstery. We can pass to the next slide. And we also got an opportunity to collaborate with many different people, which was great. We continue doing that, and you know, it's one of the best ways how you can test something new ideas, new materials. So you can see 2 shoe prototypes. There's one on the furthest, on the left side, which we done in collaboration with Slovak studio Crafting Plastics. They do also very interesting work. They work with bioplastics. So they have patented a material called muatan, which is based on PLA, I think, and it is fully biodegradable. And so we were thinking about the concept of a shoe where their material can be used, as outsole and our material as an upper, and sort of how do they combine, what is the durability of this product. Another bit more traditional shoe was made by a designer called Eva Klavalova. You can see this, the blue one. And I've been actually wearing them for over a year, and it was fine. They actually survived monsoons as well, surprisingly. But there is, with this type of shoes, we still have a bit of a challenge to stretch them, because this way of manufacturing requires you to take your material and pull it over a last. And since our material doesn't have that kind of stretchability, it's a little more difficult to make this type of shoe. You can also see an exhibition that we did in Prague at the Prague Design Festival in 2018, I think, yes. And we basically showcased different collaborations we did with designers over there. You can see two stools made by a Czech company, Ton. They are one of the oldest manufacturers of wooden bench furniture. And then in the back, you can see different prototypes of accessories and shoes. And, since we were in Czech Republic, people don't really, we don't really see coconuts over there very often. So you kind of have to present people with the coconut and show them, like, this is what a coconut, this is the coconut, so that the connection is very direct. So we made this a massive 220 meters high wall as a backdrop, which had our logo and I think over 1,000 shells, coconut shells that we attached to it. We sent them all from India, so it was an international operation. But a very nice event. As a result of that, in the following year, 2019, we actually were nominated for El Deco International Design Award, and we won it in the category of Talent of the Year, which was very nice. We can pass to the next slide. We also have done this mirror with Czech Studio. This is a workshop we have done with University of Tomáš Bata in Zlín with students of footwear design and furniture design. And as a result of that, they organized an exhibition showcasing basically the use of new material on products that they were taught to make and to design. So you can see a couple of accessories and also a small stool or kind of a rocking chair made by a student there. We can pass to the next slide. And here we're coming back to Kerala. I don't really know how to connect this past slide and this slide, but I guess my intention was to tell you a little bit more about where we currently are, or how we evolved post 2000 or in 2019. Ever since we've been to Kerala, we were based in Kerala. Every year between mid-June to end of September is really problematic for us because of the rain. It's especially, I think, the last 2 years have been very, very strong and complicated. So we opted to close, during those 1.5 months, because otherwise, you get things like constant power cut. Some of your employees cannot make it because of the flood. Everything has a mold in, it's like in Mumbai, like when it rains for 3 days continuously, like even your polyester clothes, might get involved somehow. I don't know. But every time, we close for a certain time, it creates also a massive gap for us financially, as a company, because you still have to pay rent, you have to pay your employees, so it's a difficult time for us. And so in June or something like May 2019, we decided, okay, like we really need a dryer to continue running our operations during the rain, because otherwise this is going to be very, very difficult for us. Um, and for that, we needed funding, which we didn't have, so we decided to organize a crowdfunding campaign. So here you can see our workshop and also part of our team in Kerala. So you have Johnny, who was my intern from Slovakia, who was preparing, the whole layout for the campaign, helping us with a lot of different things. There's Sindhu, our manager of operation, myself, and Rani and Biju, who are two of our workers in the production unit. We can pass to the next slide. And where are we? And the crowdfunding campaign is also something we've done for the first time in our lives. And so we wanted to keep it kind of interactive or interesting for the backers. So we decided we're going to design a small collection of accessories for them, so that, depending on the contribution they make to our cause, they can choose a different type of accessory. And this was interesting also for another reason for us, because this is basically the first time that we offered the products from Malai to a broader audience, commercially. These are actually our kind of alpha users, because we do work with, companies and brands who seek for materials. So we are kind of material suppliers, but this process is quite long term, because every time, a company decides to try a new material, they have to first try it, they have to test it, they have to prototype several times of it, and only then, if it passes everything, they decide to start using it. Apart from that, we are still quite small scale, so that only works for smaller, small scale brands as well. So here you can see some of the examples of the rewards that we designed. We can pass to the next slide. You can see all the different colors as well. All the colors that we use, actually, I forgot to say, are natural dyes. So we use a cold bath dyeing process. We collaborate with Natural Dyes Lab in Uttar Pradesh. We developed and patented this method of dyeing, which doesn't require heat. We can pass to the next slide. We ran the crowdfunding campaign in October, November, and it was successful. We pledged for 15,000 euros. We managed to raise over 18,000, so that was great, and we were very happy. Here you can see a collaboration with one of the most, I guess, famous and respected fashion designers in Czech Republic. Her name is Libiana Rochova. She's an amazing human being and a very inspiring woman. And she designed kind of a bag/object for our campaign. Basically, you can see that the very understanding of material and the use of material she has is very, very different, from most of the kind of more commercial outcomes that we usually get to work on. She literally just like felt the material. She's like, okay. She, joined it in like 2 different places and decided it's going to be kind of a shell for either a bag that you can use like in 3-4 different ways, or because the material Malai kind of holds shape really nicely, you can actually mold it and it will stay in certain shape. She also suggested it can be used as an interior object, for storing whatever, from newspapers, flowers, whatever you want. You can pass the next slide. Another interesting collaboration, which brings us back to Lucia. There you can see her. And Eva, who I mentioned before with the blue shoe, they designed a pair of sandals for us. And we really tried working hard on maintaining the whole shoe biodegradable. Unfortunately, we didn't manage with the outsole, the very layer that touches the ground, because there is simply nothing currently available. And we didn't have time to develop a completely new material. But most of the shoe is biodegradable. We can pass to the next slide. So this was the first also commercially available shoe. And we're coming back to, or we're coming now to 2020, which has been quite interesting so far, but the beginning was nice. At the beginning, we applied to a Circular Design Challenge, which is one of the sustainability design awards here in India. It's run by, I think, IMG Reliance and United Nations India, and they award different kinds of projects that work within or that work with the concept of sustainability or with principles of sustainability within realm of fashion. And so I remember I applied and I was like, I don't really know. We apply to like fundings and grants on a regular basis, and sometimes it's just frustrating because you put so much time into it, and often also resources, and obviously not always it works out. So my hopes were not high, but we actually got selected to the top 5 finalists, along with 4 another young Indian brands. And it was very interesting for me because suddenly I was back in the fashion world after like almost 10 years, and this is actually the field that brought Malai to victory in this case. And so we presented a collection of the accessories that we had designed for the crowdfunding campaign. But we also we got a chance to tell our story through this composition, which was particularly interesting. So here you can pass to the next slide. The inspiration for our storytelling were, of course, coconuts, and there's more to coconuts than we thought. And we wanted to also put an emphasis on the place where we are based, and where this material kind of originates from, which is Kerala, a beautiful corner of the planet, which if anything describes it, then it would be the coconuts and the greenery, beautiful nature. And so we went back to the archives and looked at some older pictures, which are particularly beautiful, I think. And you can see people, I think, somehow much more adjusted to their environment in terms of clothing, in terms of their styling than I see these days, I guess. So we want to base our story on that as well, or we got inspired by that. So all our models were wearing mundus in different styles, and all the clothes were basically made from this traditional fabric. We wanted to promote the idea of a kind of universal piece of clothing, which mundu really is. If you think about it, you can style it in so many different ways, yet it remains a piece of fabric. It carries a very beautiful idea. Next slide, please. And so that was 2020 at the beginning. Right now we are, of course, under the lockdown, so we are just wondering. We're just getting used to the new normal. But I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the realm of materials and how actually new materials emerge in the world, because it is kind of a practice or a field that I think is becoming very popular these days, especially within the realm of design. But I think sometimes, especially for students, it's difficult to imagine what do they actually do there, because it requires a very multidisciplinary approach, and as a student you don't necessarily know from the beginning how to work with people from different expertise, and how to approach a project where you might be asked to develop a new material or explore certain resources and create a material out of it. So I would describe the process, or I would divide the process in 3 different approaches. And these I named targeted research, which is a bit more of a scientific approach. Then there's a second approach, which is mostly exploring possibilities of given resources, which is very often the approach you see in design, but also in craft and maybe early industries or manufacturers. And then there's a third approach, which are called material explorations, which very often you see in design and art. We can pass to the next slide. And I will talk a little bit about each one of them. So the science approach, it's like a, kind of a classical way of developing new material, but it's very structured. As a material scientist, you would, let's say, you would receive a brief telling you, we want to enhance certain property of a certain material by this many percent, or we want to make it, I don't know, hydrophobic. How do we do it? And after receiving brief, field of study would be identified. So you have to find out which field of material research actually needs to be contacted. And then targeted studies would be conducted, which means you would identify different strategies that you can use for enhancing that material property. You would conduct different experiments, different tests, then you would draw conclusions from it. You would go back to your experiments, but refine them in a certain way. And then, as in case of most of the scientific ways of working, you would publish, your findings or your knowledge in an article. And then, if everything is viable, you might end up contributing to scaling certain, industry or introducing a material into the world. So here's a picture of a scientist exploring insulator metal transition and substrate independent DO2 thin film for phase change devices. When you see these publications, it very often is discouraging for design students because it's written in a very different language than we normally use in our field. But I think if you are drawn towards working with materials, it is very essential you at least try to understand and develop a certain vocabulary you can use when talking to people from material science. We can pass to the next slide. Which is exploring possibilities of given resources, which is, I think, very nice. And I think it is kind of maybe the most oldest way of thinking about the materials, because somewhere at some point in the history, there had to be a kind of a caveman who picked up the stone and he wondered, what can I do with it? But it was the material that preceded the idea of the product. First, there was a material. Only then you can develop a product. And so here I have just a small example of this approach, which is by, I think, a Korean designer, Sine Kim, who developed her own technique of glazing tiles, ceramic tiles, using urine as a material. Again, in big cities, perhaps you can consider urine as a viable material because there must be so much of it. So, why not exploring this possibility? Next slide, please. And the third approach that I wanted to tell you something about is doing material exploration. And this is, oh, sorry, there's one more example I forgot about. So yeah, sorry, we are not at the third approach yet. We are still at exploring the resources. This is just an example from the project I worked on during my time in Mumbai for the big manufacturer. So here's, for example, one of the materials that I was working on, which is waste from turning and boring processes. And the company manufactures a lot of different metal compounds and components for a lot of different industries. And you can see that, especially in case of mild steel and aluminium, there's actually quite a large quantity generated per year. And that itself, many people would say, oh, but it's metal, it can be recycled easily, which yes, it's true, but not in this form. Especially when it comes to aluminium, because of the surface area, this material, when you try to remelt it, it oxidizes before it can melt. So it kind of turns into dust, before you can transform it into recycled material. So I was looking at different ways or alternative ways of reusing this form of aluminium. What can you do with it? How can you perhaps prepare it better for the recycling process? Next slide, please. And again, I kind of went into the field of metallurgy, and I read a lot of studies, talked to metallurgists, and I found out there is a process called hot compacting, which uses less amount of heat and uses pressure in order to compact the material. And in that way, you're able to get a solid piece of aluminium again. The properties will be, in terms of, let's say, strength, it will be less than of like remelted aluminium or virgin aluminium, but you can still use this form of material for a lot of products. For example, within the realm of interior design, maybe furniture design, something that doesn't require that much of a load. So here you can also see us working in the factory. Yeah. I just remember it was really, really hot in these factories, and I was wondering the whole time how on earth people can work in these temperatures. And now here I am, in the peak summer in Kerala, experiencing the very same. Getting used to it. Next slide, please. Which I think, yes, that's where the material explorations begin. And this is perhaps an approach which might be the closest to you when you begin experimenting with, materials, their preparation, their transforming material. And it very often comes from a simple curiosity. You're curious how materials behave. You're curious if you, let's say, dip a styrofoam in a pane, what comes out. It's a kind of more spontaneous approach. And here as an example, I give a project of one of my peers, Sophie Rowley, is a Berlin-based designer. And she works with a range of materials, from textile, metals, epoxy resin, you name it. And the main factor for her is the visual side of the material, the kind of an illusion of something that she's creating. So it's much closer to art, perhaps. But she's a very skilled craftsman, and she's got an amazing, sense of aesthetics. So she's been able to work her style of working and work for really interesting projects. I think the samples that you're seeing, the kind of bluish samples, were made for David Chipperfield architects for a project they commissioned for her for. And she was asked to develop material samples mimicking water in water's different state, and you can really see it in the materials. And she doesn't necessarily think about circularity or kind of a more environmental aspects of the material, because that's not there in the picture for her. She mostly works in small scale projects. Next slide, please. And here is another material exploration with a very different outcome. For example, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with sugru. Sugru is a type of kind of a clay polymer or just a polymer that was invented by one Irish designer. So again, it wasn't a scientist, it was a student of design who was driven initially by idea of fixing things. She didn't want to design anything new, you know, because she saw there's so much already designed and produced in the world. So she wanted to concentrate more on fixing. And so she started playing with different kinds of, you know, polymers, different types of clays, finding out, you know, how to create this kind of substance that would allow her to fix things. And she invented Sugru, which became an international hit. You know, you can the mode of application is very user friendly. You just open the packet, you know, you mold your clay or polymer in a shape that you want, and it hardens all the time. Next slide, please. What do we have in the next slide? And so these are three different approaches, but very often, if you're working on something, on a project which is, you know, more long term, you will end up combining all three approaches. For example, you might start with student projects where.
Sorry,
What?
Sorry, I think my connection failed me.
Oh, okay, okay.
Sorry, we start again. Sorry, here.
No problem. So yes, you might start with you know, simple task of exploring some material exploration, doing some material exploration. You know, just kind of finding out what a material is about and, you know, what it consists of and how it behaves in different environments and the different conditions. And gradually, you know, you might widen this approach into exploring possibilities of your available resources or the resources that you work with. That's kind of yeah, that's kind of where we, you know, that's kind of how we proceeded as well. You know, my whole fascination with bacterial started, cellulose started really as material exploration. Only, you know, after coming to India, I got an opportunity to think about it from a different perspective. It was no longer kind of lab scale, you know, experimental project that I did somewhere in my room. But you know, I was working, or I got a chance to work with and think about different scale of possible for this project. And also, I got an opportunity to think about an impact that such a material that I'm bringing into this world could have on the environment. And then you might also proceed to the targeted research, you know, where you already have a material that you want to, that has a potential, you know, that wants to go somewhere, but you need to develop it further, you need to tailor it further. So that's generally where you would start also collaborating with a lot of material scientists, which is what we do these days as well. Next slide, please. And the process of material exploration can be very similar to a process of exploration of anything. So you start with the research, you do initial experiments. They might go well, you know, you might be proceeding on the curve, and suddenly you think, oh, I'm a genius, you know, I really nailed it, I have the product. And then you start, you try to replicate it, or you try to develop it further, and you're like, ah, damn it, you know, it's not working, and you become really frustrated with yourself and blaming yourself for a lot of failures. But I think the important thing in this process is just to have the patience, you know, to persevere, because that's really what, you know, in many cases, success is about. You have to have the patience and determination to to keep doing what you do if you really believe in it, if you think it has a place in this world, then of course there will be obstacles. Of course you feel that, sometimes what you do is totally worthless and doesn't make sense. That's completely normal. But if that's really what you want to do, then keep up, and maybe you'll find a success. Who knows? Thank you. Next slide. Um, and what really, determines if you go down the path of inventing new materials, or what really determines whether your material stays or not, because sometimes you might be working on a project really, really hard, but you don't necessarily realize that there are some important factors, stopping your project from development that are very valid. We don't we often forget to keep that distance between what we do and how other people might view it, and how is it really relevant, which is the critical thinking that you need to have in you. And so, for example, when you have a new material on the scene, what is important? Well, first of all, you have to have available resources, because if you want to make something and you don't have nothing to make it of, then you cannot make it. It has to be scalable, because at some point, if your product's gonna pick up and you really get a chance to make it into a sustaining business, then you need to know how to scale it up, which might not necessarily be vertically. It doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna build up a huge factory, and churn, thousands of meters or something. You might think about it differently. You might think about it more as a horizontal way of scaling up, which is probably more long term. Does your material comply with the performance required? The material has to be functional. Of course, there are also materials that perform mostly from aesthetical point of view, but that does have its limits. So you always have to keep in mind that material does have a utilitarian, property as well. Is it culturally relevant? If I today decided I'm going to make a Bloody Mary out of human blood, it might not pick up, right? Because I don't think there are many people who would do that in the world. So cultural relevance definitely is something to consider. Funding, very important, and often very frustrating. For everything you want to develop, be the project, the business, you need funding. And I remember from my student times, it's one of the things that nobody really explained to us, and it took me a while to adopt that way of thinking, that I actually need funding for everything. There are many ways, to go around it, and you certainly will learn the vocabulary and the structure of everything over time. But it is an important factor. And last but not least, you need a market for your material. You need to know it very well. So, in my case, I actually still kind of work within a fashion industry, even though I diverted from it in quite a large circle. But my advantage is I actually know the industry very well, and that's why I'm able to survive in it, And so it is important for you as well, should you decide to go down the route of developing new materials. Very, very many different areas you need to understand. You need to have the humility to respect other people's experience, and also respect the other views that they might have about your fantastic materials, because it is a valuable piece of advice. So I think that that was pretty much the last informative slide I had for you. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was not a waste of time for you, and that you learned something new. And I'll be happy to answer your questions should you have some.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Zuzana. That was quite detailed and quite interesting for us to learn. And quite honestly, it's very nice to know that there are so many different things that we put to waste that could actually be used as textiles. So without taking a lot of time, I know we've exceeded our understanding with you, but I'll quickly try to take up as many student questions as possible. Am I clearly audible to you?
Yes.
Great. Okay, there is a question here. This question is from Shaina Randawa. She's studying the postgraduate program in luxury brand management at the Pune campus, and she would like to know what promotion techniques, according to you, are best to promote a brand like yours.
Sorry, say it again. I think I didn't hear some part of it.
She'd like to know what promotion techniques
Today I made paneer bomb.
best.
Paneer bomb.
Yes.
Sonam.
I
So
heard
sorry.
something about paneer now. So ways of promotion. Ways of promotion. I think these days it's actually much more friendly environment when it comes to promotion than it used to be, because you have social media and you can tailor the way you want to tell your story. You are actually in control of that, and it doesn't cost you a lot to do that. So I would say social media is probably one of the best ways of promoting yourself. Other than that, it's also very important to have a connection with like the real people, because people on social media sometimes act a little differently than in real life. So what I found very helpful in our case is to join events, fairs, design festivals, because that's, when you go, let's say, to a design festival, it's like 3 or 5 days, which are incredibly intense, because you're there presenting your work, constantly talking to like thousands of people. But the feedback you get is incredibly valuable, because it's not digital, it's like real time conversations, and people come with like kind of a real deal approach. So that's also a very important thing, and I hope that as students you do get.
Absolutely. Daphne Hernandez would like to ask, she writes, Hi Zuzana, with all the changes in the world, especially COVID-19, do you think the fashion industry will involve more of gloves and masks into their design line? Do you think we'll be using more of those?
I mean, honestly, I don't really think that the masks work. The case is just, I personally view it as an act of solidarity. If like we put the masks on in a maybe population which is extremely dense, then I think I would use it anyway, whether there is COVID or not. But yeah, of course, you can see it already. A lot of fashion brands are incorporating masks and gloves in their summer collections, and I think why not? Fashion is also fun. It's a lot about communication, so it is inevitable. Um, but I think we should also keep in mind that this is hopefully a temporary measure, and more than a fashion statement, it is an act of solidarity, an act of perhaps protection, and that's its primary function.
Right, right. Sonam has a few questions to ask as well. Sonam, over to you.
Great, thanks, Corey. So, Susanna, I actually have one personal question to you, which I think is so important to ask. I've read somewhere in your interview that you said sustainability is clarity. I actually loved what you wrote after that, but could you share that with the students? Because we hear sustainability has become now a buzzword, and it's almost kind of used around very loosely. But I loved your definition of the word sustainability. So if you don't mind, could you share that with us first? And then I have a few other questions that my students had prepared and have asked me to ask on their behalf. So
Sure. Yes, I think I've been asked that in one of the interviews recently, already during the COVID times, and I think it is about clarity, because when you have clarity, you get a chance and an opportunity to form your own conclusion, to use your own intelligence to derive conclusion, which is very important, because then you no longer feel like you're being fed certain
We can't hear you, Zuzana. Uh, yes.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Well, I think my earphone charge will be finishing, so I hope they can make it. But yeah, I think clarity is important because if you have the facts, the numbers available for people to read by themselves, to evaluate by themselves, then they don't need false promises and advertising necessarily, because that's what clarity is about. You have information that should be open source as well, and only then you're able to believe in something and take it seriously. So I think,
Great.
yeah, that's my answer.
Great. I have a question from Abhishek Soni. He asks, how would you like to take this material forward? Since we're talking about material sciences and the future of material, and the scientific approach to any material is to always increase the performance, to better the performance through various percentages. This is something that you shared with us during your presentation. So if you had to look at this material and you had to better the performance,
Sonam, we are losing you there. Would you like to switch off your video and then continue with the microphone, please?
I think she maybe disconnected completely.
Yes, she's coming back and I think we lost her.
Okay.
Sonam, you'll have to discontinue the video, please. There's a network issue from your end. Sonam, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, Sonam. Would you like to ask the question again, please?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So Abhishek Soni has a question for you, and he asks, what is the future of this material? When we talk about material sciences and the future of materials, am I audible?
Yes, Sonam, go for it.
So when we talk about material sciences and the future of materials, how can you better increase the performance of this particular material as a material scientist? Have you thought about what would be the future of Malai?
Yes, of course, for a long time. But that's exactly what we are doing now. Basically, we are working with IIT Hyderabad, with the department over there, to improve some of the properties of Malai, because of course, we don't have all the necessary equipment, and also it's impossible to know all this knowledge about so many different things in just like two people. So that's why we approach them, because they do have an experience with natural fibers and biocomposites and bacterial cellulose in particular. And we are doing what I described as more of a targeted research. And it's very interesting because there's nothing impossible in the material world. There's so many different fields of research, so many studies that were conducted, so many conclusions that were drawn on a huge variety of matter. So doing material research from I think a huge part comes down to narrowing down, to a strategy that you think either will work or might work, and then test it. So from a majority of parties is knowing how to work with information, knowing how to read something properly, and then have the right equipment and experiments designed to in order to try to prove it.
Great, thank you so much, Zuzana. Harleen asks, how do you make sure the material does not degrade when you use them over a period of time, or when they come in contact with water? So we already understand a few properties of Malai, but if we have to ensure it lasts for a considerably long period of time, how do we ensure that? And how are you working on improving the performance of this material in that aspect?
So first of all, every material degrades over time, regardless of the nature, whether it's plastic, a piece of wood, or a piece of textile. It is a completely natural process, but with some materials, of course, it can happen on in faster pace than with the others. When it comes to Malai, it's a wholly natural and organic material, which means it will also be slightly more sensitive to forces of nature. Um, but it doesn't mean that it will, fall apart as you're wearing it. The biodegradability just means that once you introduce it to a compost, or an environment where there's enough, microorganisms that can work on decomposition, then there's nothing that would take too long to decompose. But when it comes to contact with water, because Malai is basically based on different forms of cellulose, it will always be a bit more sensitive to humidity. But then it comes also down to the way you take care of your material, the kind of things you expose it to, and the kind of things you don't expose it to, which is not specific only for Malai. That's the kind of thing that you would do with materials regardless. For example, I don't know, your leather shoes, right? During rainy season, you might just wrap them and not use them because you know that they don't get on well with like prolonged contact with water. So the same would apply to Malai. The material would not fall apart, but you're going to weaken the material if you expose it to water for a very long time. So if you want it to last longer, then you should also use it appropriately.
Great. Thank you, Zuzana. Harleen, did that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm done with all the questions that came to me. Gauri, if there are any questions that came to you, then you can field them to Zuzana.
Right. Sonam, I don't have any DMs today. I think we have covered pretty much about uh, with regards to the webinar. Is there anything that any student would like to come on camera and discuss? You're most welcome to just put a blue hand up and we'll pick up your question.
I think a lot of students have said to us that the class was very informative, and I think the entire chat box is full of like thank yous, and it was a very interesting class, etc. I think for most of us who understand very little bit of biochemistry or molecular science, I think all of this is just right now blowing our minds. And at least for me, I feel like any kind of question may sit misplaced because I don't even have enough information to ask the question. And I'm sure most of the students are feeling this way. But I just feel like your story and I remember reading somewhere that between you and your partner, Sue Smith, you all went through over 100 experiments. And I just want to say that again, 100 experiments. And this is not even the experiments that happened before Malai with, the human blood and your experiments with molecular gastronomy and all the other experiments that you went through of growing God and the many other experiments that you spoke to us about. But I think it has been such a phenomenal journey, and I'm just so grateful that you shared it with all of us. But if anybody else would like to say anything, ask a question, or simply say something to Zuzana, the floor is really open. So we're happy to have you interact with Zuzana directly. Also, a lot of people asked for her Instagram handle. It's @. Please tag Zuzana in your Instagram stories. Please give her all the love. Her Instagram handle is @malai.biomaterials. Please check out her Instagram page. Please support Zuzana for this fantastic venture that she started off with Sue Smith, and what she's trying to make of it. And I think we need more of this in the world. I think all of us agree we need more of Malai in the world.
Right.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I almost sort of started saying my thank you already. But please, guys, if anyone wants to say anything, please take the floor.
You know, Sonam, I mean, you started saying your thanks, and while listening to Zuzana, there was so much to absorb, and there was so much gratitude coming through, because these are, it's too scientific, I'd say, perhaps, for us to digest, being from the fashion industry, but very, very appreciative of the fact that you got us this knowledge today. Students, may I please request everyone today to switch on their cameras. Yes. We have to draw the heart. This has been very, very insightful for us.
Yes.
I would request each and every student who's attending this to quickly switch on your cameras, and let's extend a huge thank you to Zuzana. Thank you so much, Zuzana.